Okay, we have a very large crowd tonight to do some learning with us. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Amanda Sutton. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your longtime independent bookstore. We're located in the North Valley of Albuquerque. Right now, closed for business, for browsing anyway, not for business. Closed for browsing due to Governor Lujan Grisham's stay-at-home order. We are operating online only, folks, so please do support us by going to our website. It's Bookworks without the O's. That's BKWRKS.com. Whole bunch of consonants. I'll drop that into the chat as well as the link to buy the book that we are presenting this evening. Another University of New Mexico Press title in collaboration with the National Hispanic Cultural Center. We're very pleased to have Valerie Martinez with us again tonight, friend and colleague. She's helped with several events over this course of pandemic virtual eventing from my home studio. Valerie's the Director of History and Literary Arts over at the NHCC, I believe also operating from home as we all try to stay safe as these COVID numbers continue to rise. We are offering curbside service at Bookworks. So what you do is you go online, you buy your books there, you can choose in-store pickup or right now free shipping through the month of November. So through November 30th, we have free shipping over purchases of $40, 40 or more, I should add. So it's free ship 40 is your coupon, and you can ship to yourself or to someone that you love who also loves books. We're very pleased to be offering this event tonight to give us a look at some of the cultural aspects of our Southwest region here, to look at language. And I'm very pleased to turn it over now to Valerie Martinez. She's going to introduce our two speakers for tonight. Please do think about picking up this book or another one to help us stay afloat during this pandemic and continue to offer these kind of learning experiences. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Valerie, would you like to tell us more about our authors?
Good evening, everyone. Bienvenidos. Buena noche. So nice to see you all here. I'm so glad for this wonderful crowd here tonight to celebrate this book and these authors. I'm the Director of History and Literary Arts, as Amanda said, at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, and we exist to preserve, promote, and advance Hispanic, Latinx arts, culture, and humanities. And language is very important to us, promoting Spanish language, whether it's native Spanish language learners and speakers or heritage Spanish language speakers and learners. And this book is very exciting. I really want to encourage you all to purchase it if you can. I want to say before we start that I do have in my mind and my heart, as we all do, are spiking numbers in New Mexico right now. And so for all of you, I hope that you're safe and healthy. I'm thinking about you and all your loved ones. And I know that some of us have experienced losses. So I just want you to know that we're thinking about that too. As we kind of gather together here. And I do think there's something sort of healing and wonderful about being able to be together, especially at this time, and to be able to talk about books and talk about language. So I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm really grateful to Bookworks and to University of New Mexico Press. We hatched up this idea a few months ago, took a look at the UNM catalog for this fall, and they were kind enough to let me say, I want to have an event around these books. And so I want to thank them for that. I want to thank Bryce at UNM Press, everyone at UNM Press, Amanda, and everyone at Bookworks. And so I'm going to just jump in and introduce our authors and turn it over to them so they can tell you about this wonderful book. Rebecca Blum-Martinez is professor of bilingual education in the Department of Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies at the University of New Mexico, where she specializes in bilingualism, second language learning, and language maintenance and revitalization in language minority communities, particularly Spanish-speaking and American Indian populations. Mary Jean Habermann López's leadership in bilingual education spans more than 40 years, including directing the New Mexico and Title VII bilingual multicultural education program for 15 years. During her tenure at the New Mexico Department of Education, some of Habermann López's accomplishments include initiating the first dual language immersion program in the state, establishing agreements with ministers of education in Mexico for professional development and teacher exchanges, and assisting with policy development for the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Office of Civil Rights. And it is my pleasure to present to you Rebecca and Mary Jean for tonight's presentation.
Mary Jean, are you there?
I'm here, yes.
All right, we'll get Rebecca unmuted here. There she is. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi there. I started talking and didn't realize that I had been muted. So I said, buenas noches a todos. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited that our long years of working on this text is finally out. I want to thank especially the University of New Mexico, the College of Education and Human Sciences that provided financial and professional support for this book, as well as the Center for Regional Studies at UNM, and especially Gabriel Melendez, who was instrumental in helping us. And I also want to thank all of the authors who contributed to this volume. We know how hard you all worked on this, and we are so very grateful to you. And so I turn it over to Mary Jean to introduce herself, and then we'll move on.
Good evening. Thank you all for being with us. My name is Mary Jean Habermann López, and I'm, like Rebecca, very excited to have this long process completed where we can share with you the history of bilingual education in New Mexico, its early years, its pioneers, and its accomplishments. I would like to thank Rebecca as well, my co-author, for all of the support that she has lent me, because I am not an academic, and because of her knowledge and understanding of academia, we were able to produce this book. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mary Jean. Whoops. Now my screen won't move. So we like to start the book with this quote from Senator Joseph Montoya, who made this statement in 1969. He says, "But what of those of our citizens that were here on this land second only to the Indian? Unlike the Anglo-American, the Spanish-speaking American had to give way, as did the American Indian. He lost lands which he had held for centuries. He lost his footing in his community. He became the governed in his village. His language, which had been the tongue of commerce, became the mark of the foreigner. Suddenly, this was no longer his land or home." Senator Joseph Montoya made this statement in 1969 when he promoted an interagency for Hispanic Americans across the federal government. He served at the federal level as senator for 12 years, and previous to that served in the New Mexico legislature and was lieutenant governor of New Mexico 3 times, and tried over and over again to establish Spanish as a language of public use.
So why did we write this book? New Mexico is hardly mentioned in any of the books on the history of bilingual education. We hear about Florida, we hear about Texas, Massachusetts, California, but we never hear about New Mexico. Yet New Mexico played a vital leadership role at the national level. Our book tells the stories of bilingual education pioneers, state initiatives, and materials, and it documents the history for the future. And by the way, I'd like to mention that Dr. Malu Gonzalez and Rebecca Blum-Martinez, pardon me, Rebecca, their chapter on our leaders in Hispanic and Native American bilingual education chronicles the stories that we include in the book. We wrote it using original material with the idea of inspiring future leaders and informing historians and bilingual educators, and also to be used in preparing future teachers of bilingual education. The story we relate contrasts with early efforts for native language instruction through bilingual education. As one of our authors, Dr. Felipe Gonzalez, states, who authored the chapter, The History of the Spanish Language in New Mexico from 1846 to 1965, he says, quote, "This chapter illustrates the long history of Nuevo Mexicanos' attempts to establish effective and permanent Spanish language bilingual teaching programs in New Mexico schools, only to be met by resistance and socio-political obstacles, with the result of and failure at every turn. Critical language scholars see how this legacy of frustration has made for trends of low educational achievement among Nuevo Mexicano youth. It also contributes to a greater project of stripping Nuevo Mexicano generations of a right to speak their Spanish, of a right to their Spanish speaking heritage."
So our book, I'm sorry, I don't know why my, our book is organized in 13 chapters. And we want to let you know that the authors of these chapters, many of them are pioneers themselves who wrote these chapters and or participated in particular initiatives. But the first part of our book, the first section, is Indigenous New Mexico, the role of language in a way of life. The second section of our book is Experimentation, Policies, and Legislation. And the third is Innovations. In Indigenous New Mexico, we have 3 chapters. The first by Mr. Regis Pecos, who writes about the teachings of his elders and intertwines those teachings with the different governments that have oppressed Pueblo people, the Spanish, the Mexican, and then the American, and talks specifically about the very ways in which Pueblo people have resisted and maintained their ways, their language and their cultures. In the second chapter, Dr. Vincent Huerito talks about English boarding school policies and follows that trend from that time all the way to the very incredible pioneering work of Rough Rock Demonstration School and Rock Point Demonstration School. And in the third chapter, we have Bilingual Education in Pueblo Country by Dr. Christine Sims, who is a pioneer in her own right. In the second section, Experimentation, Policies, and Legislation, in the first chapter, we have Dr. Felipe Gonzalez that Mary Jean just mentioned. And then we have Mary Jean Habermann writing about the Pecos Project. The Pecos Project started in 1962, and it was the first time in New Mexico that children were taught to read in Spanish in a public school setting. And it was an experimentation that Mr. Henry Pascual began. And then she follows the story of this going on into other initiatives in the state and federally. In chapter 6, I outlined the initial policies, legislation, and decisions that were made in New Mexico. New Mexico had the first bilingual language policy in 1967. This is prior to the Bilingual Education Act. And I talk there about the different people who made these different policies and legislation happen. And then in chapter 7, we have doctors Mia Sosa Provencio and Rebecca Sanchez write about Serna versus Portales, which was a groundbreaking case in which, for the first time, civil rights of Spanish-speaking people was upheld as needing bilingual education specifically. And then in the last chapter in this section, Mary Jean and I talk about New Mexico's role in federal policies, something that is not well known, but where we see once again people like Senator Montoya playing a role at the federal level. And in the last section, innovations, preparation, and leaders, Mary Jean, Beverly Argos Calvo, and I talk about the different innovations in bilingual education at the time. Everyone needs to remember that there was no bilingual education at this time, so there was no path or model to follow, and people were developing different kinds of bilingual education in different parts of the state and for different age groups. In chapter 10, Dr. Loretta Salazar and Thomasina Hannum talk about assessing the Spanish language proficiency of bilingual teachers. And in chapter 11, Julia Rosa López Emsley talks about the development of instructional materials for bilingual education programs, both here in the state and nationally. And then in chapter 12, Mary Jean talks about the important role of the State Bilingual Advisory Committee, which helped the public education department to move ahead with a great number of initiatives in bilingual education. And finally, the leaders are featured in a chapter by Maria Luisa Gonzalez, Beverly Argos Calvo, and myself. Beverly and Maria Luisa talk about the Spanish-speaking leaders, and I feature the indigenous leaders, and this is how our book ends. But there were several themes that came through as we did all of this work. And one of the themes are ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In the city of Portales, the children in Portales were terribly discriminated against. And Judy Serna, for whom the Serna case is named, went to kindergarten and was sent home because she did not speak English. And what we see in the chapter by Doctors Sosa Provencio and Sanchez is ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And so we have activist migrant workers who became involved and took the lead in terms of this particular case. And so we have a quote from Judy Serna talking about her grandmother. My grandma did a lot. I remember them doing a lot of huelgas. They would get in groups and go to the courthouse and protest. I remember my grandma would always be like, don't let them spank you. If they spank you, let us know. We also see an incredible woman, Esther Martinez from Okeowinge, who began her work in linguistics as a janitor and later went on to study her language, went on to write her language, to write grammars of her language, and became the first coordinator of a language program in her community. She went on from there to teach other Pueblo people about writing their language. And the Native American Languages Act is named after this famous woman. And in 2004, I believe, this incredible lady got her degree in early childhood education.
Another person we'd like to share information with you about is Rena Henry, who was born and raised in Arizona, and she moved to Naschiti, New Mexico. She began working in the schools as an educational assistant at Naschiti Elementary School in the Central Consolidated School District. And when federal Title VII funding became available, she went on to receive her Associate of Arts degree and then her BA degree in education. And that required her to drive 45 minutes each way to Gallup to attend classes after work. She worked as a teacher, she was a principal. She later directed the bilingual education program for the Central Consolidated School District after she received her MA in education and an administrative license. She then went on to receive her doctorate from the Fielding Graduate Institute. Her graduate studies focused on the attitudes of young Navajo students towards their language and their literacy. Under her direction, she initiated a secondary school bilingual program with Navajo literacy and social studies classes that were extremely successful. I had the privilege of seeing some of those classes when I worked in the department. After starting out as an educational assistant, her remarkable achievement as a PhD served as a model for many other Indigenous educators over the years, and she was always very happy to guide and mentor those who came after her. Many Navajo educators stand on her shoulders. Next, we see Roberto Mondragon, who was the first Hispanic lieutenant governor of any state in the United States, and the youngest as well. He authored the first bilingual education statute in New Mexico and in the nation in 1969 when he was a state senator. Born in Puerto de Luna, a tiny village in eastern New Mexico, he spent many summers with his grandfather on his ranch in Antonchico, another tiny hamlet in eastern New Mexico. He was raised speaking Northern New Mexico Spanish and experienced all the traditional Hispanic customs and folklore common to this part of the state. In our interview with him, he said, as we see here, the values of honesty and hard work taught to me by my grandfather when I labored in the fields as a young boy have stayed with me all my life. His love for New Mexico Spanish and its heritage became the focus of his life's work. In addition to becoming a songwriter and entertainer, he wrote and sent a monthly newsletter in Spanish to the schools that highlighted New Mexico's folkways, history, culture, and people. The second theme in our book is really a segue from the first. Excuse me as I get my notes together here, they're falling. The Hispanic and Native American people have consistently defended their languages and cultures in New Mexico. My chapter on the Pecos Project describes the very first bilingual education programs in New Mexico. It was funded through a Ford Foundation grant titled Teaching Spanish to the Spanish-Speaking Child, and the grant was written by Henry Pascual, who at the time was the Director of Foreign Languages in the New Mexico State Department of Education. Pascual believed instruction through the mother tongue would give students equal footing with their Anglo counterparts and was, quote, the return of the language and the culture to the people that belong to the people, unquote. A videotape of instruction at Pecos was shown at the famous NEA Symposium in 1966. This historic symposium brought together national legislators and education leaders who had been studying new bilingual education practices used for the Spanish-speaking children of the Southwest. And we have to emphasize new. This was a whole experiment going on in the country, and particularly New Mexico. It inspired New Mexico's own US Senator Joseph Montoya in the creation of the Title VII Bilingual Education Act, which Rebecca discusses fully in her chapter on the national effort. Across New Mexico, students were punished for speaking their mother tongue, as demonstrated by the quote that shows on the slide. The penalty for speaking Spanish in any school was one whack with the ruler, etc. I began a war against this practice, and those of you who ever knew Henry knew what he meant when he said he began a war. In a 5th grade classroom in Mora, New Mexico, Mr. Pascual spoke to a little girl in Spanish, and he said all of a sudden she began crying. He later found out that the school did not allow children to speak Spanish. Mr. Pascual went directly to the principal and the superintendent, explaining why this was ethically and legally wrong. Now, some teachers themselves had no idea of the psychological damage their common teaching practices were doing to our children, to our Hispanic and Native American children. In an observation of a 5th grade predominantly Navajo student classroom, Pascual observed the following sentence on the board, quote, "The early pioneers had to fight the Indian savages as they marched towards the West," end quote. When the teacher was asked why, he said, "That's what's in the book." Henry told the teacher to erase that sentence and reported it to the superintendent. In Dr. Hanem Salazar chapter on Prueba, she states that she came to New Mexico in the 1970s as a new teacher from out of state. Quote, she says, "In a small rural district in northern New Mexico, I witnessed students being scolded and punished for speaking Spanish on the playground during recess. This occurred while teachers, aides, and administrators were talking with each other in Spanish. No surprise that our students grew up concerned about what would happen if they used their mother tongue in class. It would be hard for them to overcome this early training and conditioning," end quote.
Another wonderful experiment that happened was in 1970 in Zuni, Pueblo, when Mr. Wilfred Ariacho was put in charge of the first Pueblo bilingual program. Now, this meant that he, Mr. Kirby Jachu, Belinda Betsebaye, Odell Jaramillo, and Edward Wemitiwa had to first write the language and then create the materials for the program. When I interviewed Mr. Ariacho, he said to me, and I asked him, "What would you like me to say about the work that you did?" He said, "Our ancestors remain strong, and that's what I wanted for myself and our young people." Another Pueblo first was the 1992 Pueblo bilingual endorsement for Pueblo people. The task force was made up of Dr. Christine Sims, Donna Pino, Gus Keene, Rachel James, and Dr. Henry Schonard. And they developed a portfolio process whereby the Pueblo tribes would certify language competence of the teachers. And then at that time, at the University of Albuquerque, teachers took coursework in linguistic study of native language, in teacher preparation, and other work. And this is the forerunner of the 520 certificate, which language teachers are now able to get. Another theme, of course, is community involvement. And I had the great pleasure of interviewing Mr. Tony Armijo, who was from Magdalena. And he recounted the story of how he and his cousins and the Navajo children that went to his school in Magdalena were paddled for speaking Spanish or Navajo. And in response, Tony's father, his uncle, and a man from Alamo, the Navajo part of that community, became board members. And their first act was to prohibit the paddling of children for speaking their native language. And what happened was that the school superintendent fought this prohibition, and it turned into a big fist fight out on the streets where, as Mr. Armijo said, the gringada was on one side of the street and the Mexicans and the Indians were on the other. And this became known as the Magdalena School Board Rumble. And it was such a tense situation that the State Board of Education had to take over. Mr. Armijo and his cousins and friends left Magdalena and went to go to school in Socorro. And then after a few years, they were able to come back. And he said, all I remember was we came back and we had to take Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 in order to qualify to graduate. First, they punish us for speaking Spanish, and then they tell us to take Spanish. The other community involvement highlight is the Rough Rock Demonstration School. This school, even though it is in Arizona, was included in this book because it is part of the Navajo homelands and is considered part of the pioneering work in bilingual education. In this school, the whole community basically was involved in the development and the running of this school. And a quote from Dr. Anita Pfeiffer, who became a professor of bilingual education at UNM. She states, in the first year, every month, there was a meeting where teachers would provide parents with what they were teaching. The idea behind these meetings was to inform the parents about what the children were learning, but also to get ideas about what they wanted them to learn. It was an exchange of ideas. Since it was their school, they were giving us suggestions about what they wanted for themselves and for their children. I was fortunate enough to go to this school and see for myself the ways and incredible ways in which the community was involved in this school. I don't think I've ever seen another school like this since.
The Las Cruces bilingual education program it began in 1967 through 1980, and this program was developed by Representative J. Paul Taylor, who at the time was the director of the instruction. This was the first two-way dual language program in New Mexico, and it had phenomenal parent involvement, which brought the program into and made the program alive and brought it into the homes of the students. The teachers and principals involved informed parents every step of the way. And serving 810 families, the newsletter Mirasol, written in Spanish and English by teachers for parents, even highlighted any special events in the homes. It included the history, the culture, the heritage, student activities, and it even told parents about who had visited the program. Now, the State Bilingual Advisory Committee has been in place since 1973. And we learn in this chapter about the tremendous impact this committee had on state policy. It was created to advise the public education agency on issues that arise in teaching New Mexico's linguistically and culturally diverse students. As a channel for local community input, appointed members hailed from across the state, representing languages and the communities that offered bilingual education. My chapter describes the numerous committee actions resulting in policy outcomes throughout the years. And I'd like to cite one example from that chapter today, and that was how Carlos Chavez, a state bilingual advisory committee member and bilingual education pioneer in his own right, brought his own students to testify before the State Board of Education on the value of the gold seal for bilingualism that was placed on their diplomas in 1998. So in this case, we had local community involvement from students going all the way up to the State Board of Education. Mr. Chavez created the process for the seal at Rio Grande High School to recognize students' high achievement in Spanish and English. This actually was the forerunner of the seals now given in many states of the country. The next theme that we have in the book is the use of language and culture for learning. In Dr. Julia Rosa Emsley's chapter on instructional materials, we learn about Dr. Dolores Gonzalez. In her view, bilingual education provided her the means to accomplish a mission in saving the Spanish language. The Pecos-born educator spent much of her life working with teachers and preparing Spanish language textbooks before her untimely death in 1965. She was the first PhD from Pecos, and she was the first bilingual education professor at the University of New Mexico. Through a federal grant, she and her students developed the first readers relevant to Spanish-speaking children in New Mexico. The 6 levels of readers exemplified cultural events using Northern New Mexico Spanish and culture. And these readers filled an important gap in curriculum materials for New Mexico Hispanic students. When I taught the bilingual program in Bernalillo, New Mexico, I had a little library in my classroom, and I had those books in my library. And I always noticed how often my students delighted in fingering through and reading these materials over and over again because they could relate to them. Now, throughout our book, we also learn about Mela Ledger and her multifaceted life's work helping teachers use language and culture for learning. Raised by her grandparents in the tiny hamlet of Colonias, she learned to read the newspaper in Spanish to her grandfather, who was blind. Her multidimensional efforts built her knowledge about our students, our teachers, and the bilingual programs in our great state of New Mexico, as well as the use of how to use the state's regional linguistic and cultural variations for learning. One of her many significant efforts involved the Serna case, Serna Portales case. In one of the interviews done with her, she said that the Serna case, quote, came about from a visit by the State Department of Education that I was asked to participate in. Some of the practices we saw there were really, the children were being ignored. Their needs were definitely not being met. The teaching strategies were definitely at fault. Part of that report that I participated in went into that court case of Serna versus Portales Board of Education, as detailed in Mia Sosa Prevencia and Rebecca Sanchez's chapter on this landmark decision. Lastly, we have to just look at our 3 bilingual education statutes in New Mexico. Though each different from the other, they all supported the idea of using and maintaining the mother tongue and culture for the purpose of instructing our students, and were all inclusive of Native American languages. That was in sharp contrast to the federal emphasis on transitional bilingual education. The last section of our book talks about innovations, and there were many. In the chapter that Rebecca and I and Beverly wrote on innovations, we highlight, one of the highlights was the 1967 two-way dual language program, as I discussed a little while ago. This program offered 1/2 a day instruction in English and the other 1/2 a day of instructions to 3 groups of students, to Spanish speakers, to English speakers, and to students who had both languages in their home. It began with kindergarten students in 1967, adding 1 grade level each year and following the students through the whole curriculum, through the 12th grade. Graduating in 1980, they became, as was stated in the report, la primera y única clase bilingüe de graduantes de preparatoria K-12 en la nación. The very first and only bilingual class of graduates from a K-12 educational program. And they were recognized nationally and statewide. This program became a prototype other programs would emulate and is known today as two-way dual language education. Again, I was fortunate when I worked as a specialist in the bilingual education office under Henry to observe instruction in this program in a 10th grade biology class in 1978. And I tell you, it was just fabulous. Nobody had any problems. They were all learning. The next innovation we discuss is the New Mexico Teacher Training Network, and specifically the Las Vegas Demonstration Center. This program helped teacher trainees from northern New Mexico who were having difficulties delivering instruction or implementing any aspects of their bilingual programs. Teacher trainees committed to working at the Armijo Elementary School for an entire week. Using micro-teaching via video recorded lessons, the visiting teachers identified their own areas of need. They observed multiple lessons taught by the master bilingual teachers at the Armijo Center, and those lessons were videotaped. The teachers then analyzed those lessons, the teacher trainees. And the last step was that those trainees developed and taught their own lesson, which was videotaped, and then they again analyzed their own instruction. It was an exciting and extremely successful teacher training model. The last piece I wish to mention is Tomasina Hahnemann Loretta's chapter on Prueba tells how this innovative test was developed. With funding sponsored by Representative J. Paul Taylor, Prueba was designed to measure Spanish proficiency of bilingual teachers for the state credential. This cutting-edge test measures teachers' proficiency via situational school contexts and reflects both standard school Spanish and the vernacular in use in northern New Mexico. And that test is still being used today.
Sorry, I'm having trouble. So we want to end our presentation today as with a quote from Maria Gutierrez Spencer, who was a pioneer in her own right. She was from southern New Mexico. She studied at the University of California, Berkeley, and in New York City, and then came back to New Mexico and established one of the same kinds of network programs that Mary Jean just mentioned about Las Vegas. This one was established in Silver City. And Maria was asked to present, to give testimony at the 1973 reauthorization of the Bilingual Education Act. And she opened her statement saying, "The schools have sometimes been like a gardener." Sorry, I'm so sorry. I'll read it to you and then you can hear it. I don't know what's going on with my computer, but I'll read you this last quote. "The schools have sometimes been like a gardener who buys an expensive rose bush and cuts its roots. He plants it and lavishes care on it and is surprised that he has only produced a stump. For in his enthusiasm for change, he has killed the plant. The schools, in trying to make us what we are not, have often killed our spirit, stunted our curiosity, and deadened our feelings. Thanks very much, everybody.